So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Today we'll be going over the North American Communication Monitor, but I'm going to give just a little bit of background about the Planck Center, and then I'll pass it along to our moderator, Rick White. So for those of you who don't know, in 2005, the UA Board of Trustees established the Planck Center for Leadership and Public Relations, named for public relations leader and UA alumna Betsy Planck, to develop and recognize outstanding performance in the profession and in the classroom. It sponsors research, national awards, and service programs to advance the understanding and practice of ethical and responsible public relations. So we are here to talk today about the North American Communication Monitor. There's some really incredible research that has been done by our researchers. And I'm really excited for all of you to be able to hear it and to hear their discussion about it. So I'm going to pass it along to Rick White, who's one of our board members and teaches at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so, yeah, I'm passing it along to you, and I'm excited about today's conversation.
Colleen, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for all you're doing today behind the scenes for us. Wherever you are today, whenever you're watching us, either live or after the fact on Facebook or YouTube or one of the other platforms, thank you for being with us today and joining the Planck Center and this distinguished panel of panelists that we have, who are all great researchers in their own right, to talk about the North American Communications Monitor and what that means. And it is an interesting study. It provides a lot of information for us, but it also gives us a much bigger picture about our profession and things that we need to be talking about or thinking about professionally. The North American Communications Monitor really is a relatively late development here in North America. Beginning in 2007, one of our panelists today, Dr. Ansgar Zerfass, began the European Communications Monitor. That was 2007. In 2014 and 2015, respectively, the Latin America and Asia Pacific Communications Monitor was begun. That kind of left an obvious gap. The Planck Center tried to fill that gap and agreed in 2018 to begin a North American Communications Monitor, which we did. So this is our second report that we've done on a North American Communications Monitor, taken together with the other monitors. The Global Communications Monitor series is the largest of its kind globally for our profession. And it gives us a lot of very good information and something we always look forward to every time we have a new monitor. I'll introduce our panelists momentarily. Let me remind you that since we're on Facebook today, if you have questions during our discussion today, I'm sure you will, please use the chat feature, the comments feature in Facebook. Let us know your questions. Don't wait to the very end. We will have time for Q&A at the end, but if you think of something during the discussion today, please let us know as you think of it. We'll collect that. We'll try to get that answered at the end of our discussion today. Our panelists are all world-class, renowned, and well-known educators and researchers in our profession. Dr. Dren Meng is Associate Professor of Public Relations at the Grady School at the University of Georgia. She was the lead researcher on this year's North American Communications Monitor. She's also a member of the Planck Center Board. Dr. Bryan Reber is the C. Richard Yarbrough Professor and Department Chair of Public Relations, also at the Grady School at Georgia. Dr. Reber is the Chair of the Research Committee of the Planck Center. Dr. Karla K. Gower is the Beringer Distinguished Professor and Director of the Planck Center for Public Relations at the University of Alabama, and a well-known expert in leadership in public relations. And finally, the aforementioned Dr. Ansgar Zerfass, Professor and Chair of Strategic Communications at Leipzig University in Leipzig, Germany. He's also Professor of Communication and Leadership at the BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo. And that's going to be our panel, and they all have a lot of very good things to share with us today. Before we go to the panel, though, I'm going to ask Dr. Meng, who was the lead researcher, to give us a little bit of specific background on the NACM this year, some information about how it was put together, and a brief overview, as well as an overview of the Global Communications Monitor series. Dren, would you do that, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rick, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone, again. So the 2020 and the 2021 North American Communication Monitor is the second edition and also the newest edition of the NACM research, as mentioned by Rick earlier. It is also part of the Global Communication Monitor series, and we joined the team in 2018, and we conduct NACM every other year. So to be consistent with the Global Communication Monitor series, we explore current practice and future development of strategic communication, but we focus on the region of North America, especially the United States and Canada. So the online survey design of this edition of NACM is largely derived from the European Communication Monitor 2020 edition. So it is a very comprehensive online survey questionnaire that we were able to collect information and opinions on different topics under a unique research framework. So in this edition of NACM, readers will find rich information on 8 topics in strategic communication. The topics included COVID-19 and communication professionals' responses, ethical challenges and resources, cybersecurity, gender equality, strategic issues in our field, competency development, information on salaries, and the characteristics of excellent communication departments. And some of the topics will be presented in today's webinar. So I would like to share with our audience about some basic demographic in this edition of NACM. So we were able to collect responses from 1,046 communication professionals working in different types of organizations. Specifically, about 26 of them are from Canada and 74% of them are in the US. The sample is fairly balanced in gender. We had about 48% men and 52% of women. The average age of participants was 42 years. So the demographics that you can see on this slide that we're sharing with you show that 1 out of 3 respondents are top communication leaders, such as the head of communication in the communication department or the CEO of agencies. Of the professionals surveyed, nearly 43% have more than 10 years of professional experience in public relations and communication. And as for ethnicity, even though the majority of our sample, about 72% are white Caucasians, we still able to recruit professionals with different ethnic background as well. So this ensures the quality of our sample and also help us to dive into different groups when do comparison later, and we'll share some results. Thank you. Now back to you, Rick.
Okay, thank you so very much, Dren. We appreciate that. And I'm interested especially in the ethnicity that you show there, because one of the things that our field really needs to take a close look at going forward certainly is the diversity aspect of what we have to make sure that we're represented. And do you feel comfortable, obviously, with that breakdown in terms of ethnicity as it relates to the data that we received?
I would say it's absolutely not the perfect, diverse groups that we can hope for, but we strive hard efforts in recruitment to try to include each segment. And of course, we understand there's several ethnic groups will represent a much smaller percentage in the profession. So we hope with that small percentage presence that will help us to get more insights out of those minority ethnic groups, and which will be linked to one of the most important strategic issues I believe Ansgar will talk about later.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dren. We appreciate that. We're going to go through the monitor now. As Dren mentioned, there are, I believe, 8 segments in the monitor. We're only going to have time to talk about 4 of them today. We've picked 4 that we think are really important that you'll have a lot of interest in. But there are 8 segments. I'm going to tell you this more than once today. Feel free to download the complete monitor. You can do that at the planckcenter.ua.edu, and it's there for you. But I'd encourage you to do that. But these 4 are ones that we think might be of particular interest to you today. One of them is COVID. We lived through a really unusual year last year. And it's going to have not only affected this last year, but it's going to affect us going forward as a memory, but how we do business going forward. That was one of the topics we looked at. I'm going to ask Dr. Reber if he would go through that segment of the monitor now and share some information, what we learned through that about our COVID-19 experience. Bryan?
Thanks, Rick. And thanks to those who are viewing for being with us today or watching later the recording. We, as Rick said, have explored how communication professionals adapted to COVID-19 effects and led to successful communication during this challenging time. The first section of the survey focused on the pandemic to gather information on the perceived impact of the pandemic on communication of professionals' daily work and working environment. Also, the sources they most trusted in keeping up with the pandemic information, COVID-related information used in planning, preparing, and responding to COVID-related issues, and professional satisfaction with their organization's communication and management during this time was also assessed. As you would expect, the COVID-19 pandemic was a heavily discussed topic in North America. 83% of our respondents said that it was heavily discussed in their circles, and communication professionals in both the United States and Canada gave attention to the news about the pandemic. 3 and 4 said that they did that. 66% of respondents said the outbreak is relevant to their daily workplace, with a substantially higher percentage of Canadians responding in the affirmative to that. So Canadians said in higher percentages that the outbreak was relevant to their daily workplace than did US respondents. Professionals also confirmed that the impact of the pandemic on their daily work is significant. 2/3 said that. But there was a statistically significant difference between the percentage of Americans and Canadians. In other words, more Canadians said that it was important to had an impact on their daily work. Now, in the next slide, we're going to look at communication leaders. But before we do that, I want to talk just a little bit about gender comparisons. And we found that women perceived the pandemic as a heavily discussed topic with more regularity, but men's report a significantly higher level of perceived impact of the pandemic on their daily work. And that is 70% of men saw the pandemic as having a daily impact compared to 62% of women respondents. Now to the graph here, those holding a top leadership position, such as head of communication or CEO of an agency, report the highest impact of the pandemic on the daily work of their communication department or agency. It's interesting to note the statistically significant difference in mean response between top management, middle management, and team members in both the perceived relevance of the pandemic to daily communication work and the reported effect on that work. In the next slide, we're going to look at sources of information. This slide shows us how trusted sources of information. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about some background. So we asked questions in two different ways. We asked, first of all, the sources that communication professionals most used to gather COVID information, and the top 5 sources for accessing COVID-19 information included public health organizations and officials at 72%, national news outlets at 69%, local news outlets at 62%, state and local elected officials at 60%, and international news outlets at 53%. Now, those are the used sources. On this graph, we see trust in sources. And we see that trust in sources was more broadly distributed. About 35% said their most trusted source was public health organizations and officials. National news outlets, political leaders, social media, and local news sources all lagged well behind the health-related sources. And in the final slide I'm going to share with you, I want to note that this slide shows quite clearly the important role of communication leadership during the pandemic. Communication professionals in both the United States and Canada reported similar patterns of communication strategies during the pandemic. 72% of leaders said they used COVID-19 information to develop and implement formal safety guidelines for their organizations and infrastructure routines for their organizational client. 2/3 of leaders on two of these bar charts, 2/3 of leaders said they used COVID-19 information to develop top-level strategies, and 2/3 said they used the information to develop functional strategies that supported other units within their organizations. And just under 2/3 said they used COVID information for communication to employees or the client. The least used strategy is to propose a political stance for the leadership in the organization or for the client. Nevertheless, more than half, 55% of top leaders said they used COVID information to provide political counsel to organizational or client leadership. Overall, 7 out of 10 communication professionals said they were satisfied with their organization's communication and management during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the satisfaction level significantly decreases as the scope of leadership responsibility decreases. Leaders were more satisfied than their team members. And I believe if you think back on the 4 slides that I've shared with you, it's obvious that the uppermost management of organization had the most responsibility. And so logic follows that they would be the ones who are most satisfied and understand the most what they have done in preparation and communication around the pandemic. That's what I have to share, and I'm happy to try and address any questions that you might have briefly before we move on.
Well, thanks, Brian. One of the things that caught my attention was your slide on who do you trust, basically. For many of us in public relations and communications, we better have a really strong relationship with local media, and we see these people day in and day out. Yet local media on this issue rank considerably lower than some of these other things. I'm curious about that. Any thoughts about why that may be?
I think that the way I interpret that is that because this is such a special instance of precise information and also ever-changing information, that the health professionals and scientists were the ones who were most listened to. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't accessed through local media. It simply means that they were, as sources, were most trusted.
Interesting. Thanks very much. There's some things we can come back to this maybe a bit later in our Q&A session. I'd like to continue to move along now if we could, because there's so much information here in the monitor, and we want to get to it as much as we can. Bryan touched on this a bit, the idea of trust and who do you get your information from, and information about the pandemic and what's going on and how to do it. The pandemic also exposed some ethical issues for us. I think we saw them in many instances throughout our profession, not necessarily the profession, but professionals saw those things. And that's a fairly important thing to take a look at, ethics. I'd like for us to take a look now with Dr. Gower. Karla, would you review the results from the monitor on that section?
Sure. Thank you, Rick. So we know that ethical challenges are a perennial issue in public relations, and this past year was no different. For this NACM, we asked questions about the frequency of ethical challenges, the sources of ethical training practitioners took advantage of, the resources that they use to help guide them in dealing with ethical challenges, and then finally the ethical concerns they have about social media. So with the first slide, I wanted to share with you, in terms of the frequency of ethical challenges, 6 of 10 communication professionals in North America said that they encountered one or several ethical challenges in the past year. US professionals reported significantly more ethical challenges than did their counterparts in Canada, with 65% versus 52%. And men reported facing significantly more than women, 66 versus 58%. Where you work matters. Government organizations face the most ethical challenges, with 71% saying they had faced one or several ethical challenges in the past year, followed by consultancies and agencies. Nonprofit organizations face the least or the fewest ethical challenges. The kind of work you do also matters. In terms of the number of ethical challenges in the past year, those dealing with community relations and strategy and coordination led the way. Internal communications came in third. And interestingly though, marketing, brand, and consumer communications folks reported facing the fewest number of ethical challenges. When it comes to training, I can go to the next slide. The good news is that only 13% of the respondents in this study have never received any ethics education or training. The most popular training is by a professional association such as PRSA, followed by training in one's own organization. At one time, of course, ethics was probably learned on the job or via professional association, but with this group, at least a quarter of them have taken an ethics course in their public relations studies or communication studies. And that number should actually increase in the future. The Commission on Public Relations Education in the US is recommending an ethics course be required in public relations curriculum, so that number will go up. There's some differences in training when it comes to where you work. Attending ethics training provided by professional associations is most common in public companies, followed by consultancies and agencies. And those who work for nonprofits were the least likely to receive training from professional associations at just 30%. And that may well be tied to the cost of such training. It can be very expensive to do it via professional associations. There are also differences when it comes to job level. So many more communication leaders, 60%, have participated in ethics training by professional associations than their professionals at the team leader or the team member levels. Team member level is only at 30%. But communication leaders are also much more less likely to have participated in ethical training in their own organizations. Nearly 1/2 of the team leaders, though, say that they have participated in training at their own organization. And in fact, communication professionals in their 30s and 40s are the best educated in ethics when combining the training from professional associations, looking at training in their own organizations, plus any courses that they took in school. Unfortunately, those professionals who are 29 and younger have received the least amount of training, even taking into account the fact that they've probably had an ethics course in school. And that, I think, really needs some attention because those individuals are probably the least able to exercise ethical autonomy when faced with an ethical challenge, just because of their position in the hierarchy. And organizations really have it within their power to address that issue by offering their own training. And their own training does make a difference. A recent study by the Ethics and Compliance Initiative revealed that 87% of US employees say that their own orientation, their workplace ethics standards are what they look to for guidance when dealing with an ethical challenge at work. And we found similar results here. Most respondents say they rely on the resources from their employer when dealing with ethical challenges, which suggests that companies really would be well advised to engage in ethical standards training. Codes of ethics of professional associations and personal values were close runners up. Interestingly, US practitioners are statistically more reliant on personal values than their Canadian counterparts. I'm Canadian, not quite sure what that means, but there it is. And male practitioners say they use all three resources: professional associations, codes of conduct, organizational standards, and personal values, at a higher percentage than do females. Now, that may reflect the fact that men said that they faced more ethical challenges than the women did. It also may reflect our sample. Almost 60% of the men in our study were a communication leader, while 70% of the women were actually team members. So if a woman hasn't had to face necessarily an ethical challenge, she may not know what she would look to for guidance. Then we asked them about social media and their concerns there. We can move to, yeah. So nearly 7 in 10 professionals say they are worried about social media, and their top 3 things they worry about are the use of bots, paying social media influencers, and mining personal data by big data analyses. Practitioners in public companies are significantly more concerned about profiling audiences via demographic characteristics and about editing organization-related public wiki entries than are those working in other organizations. Nonprofits were the least concerned about those 2 categories, but they were most concerned about paying social media influencers. Male practitioners are significantly more ethically concerned than women about 3 different things: motivating employees to spread organizational messages via their own personal social media accounts, editing entries on public wikis, and 3rd, profiling and targeting audiences based on demographics such as age, gender, race. Younger professionals are more concerned about asking employees to use their own personal social media accounts to spread organizational messages, but less worried about paying social media influencers for favorable reviews. And professionals 60 and older are more worried about using sponsored content. And that difference between the younger and the older may well be a difference in comfortability about social media. What's considered ethical on social media has really evolved over the years as we become more used to it, and it's become a greater part of our lives. And you can sort of see that in the differences in attitudes here. Those who are 29 and younger don't want to be asked to use their own personal social media accounts to promote the organization. To them, that probably feels very inauthentic. Whereas older professionals, the news media are probably supposed to be very objective and neutral third parties. And so to them, using sponsored content may well seem deceptive. So that might explain some, the differences there. But overall, it appears that ethical challenges aren't going anywhere. They remain a perennial issue, especially in an age of misinformation and trust, lack of trust like we are right now. We must really be vigilant to keep ethics top of mind and to avoid unethical behavior. And to do that, it really requires continual ethical training, reminding people about it. Ethics is not a one and done topic, and it shouldn't be. Thank you.
Thank you, Karla. I'm curious, did you believe the difference, male-female difference on the last slide you just showed us is also a function of role in the organization or something else?
It may well be
Yeah,
to do with the role. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think you're right. It's those things aren't going away. And the next time we look at this, it may be completely different issues, but the whole point is that people do have ethical concerns about this landscape that we're in now. So it's very good. Thank you very much. Moving along to another section of the report is competency development. What skills do we need? How do we know that we're competent not only now but ready for the future? How comfortable do we feel? The monitor took a look at that. Dr. Meng is going to review that with us now. Dren, if you'd go ahead and tell us what you have.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Competency development is another topic that we investigate in this edition of NACM. So we all agree, based on a multiple white paper, report, benchmark study, that professionals working in communication need a broad set of skills and knowledge to fulfill their tasks. And just like Dr. Reber mentioned, the years of 2020 and 2021 really taught us a lot of lessons. And I would say perhaps the most important one is change is constant and is inevitable. So that means the need for constant improvement in core competencies and skill sets is pressing based on our professionals' responses. So on this slide that we are showing, we would like to show you is that the competency level shared by the surveyed respondents confirmed that there is a great need for communication practitioners to develop their competencies. Half of them also agreed that competencies are heavily discussed in the communication profession in their country. And then when we compared by age, we found seasoned communication professionals, especially those in the age groups of 50 to 59, 30 to 39, and 40 to 49, they are more aware of the need to advance skills and knowledge. While young professionals, those in their 20s, actually see there's no strong need for competency development. This kind of echoes what Dr. Gower just shared about the young professionals in their 20s actually reported receiving the least amount of training in ethics, and similar here for the competency development. And the communication leaders were affected significantly by all the changes associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And consistently here, communication leaders also report a much stronger need to continue advance skills and knowledge in communication management. So on next slide, let's talk about the gaps identified. So in the section of competency development, we summarized and listed 6 core competencies, which include the data, technology, management, business, self-reflection, and the communication competencies, these 6 core areas. And we asked communication professionals to share 2 ratings. And the first rating is about how important these competencies are in their daily practice. And the second rating is about their personal assessment of how ready they are or how prepared they are in these areas. And we found that the largest gap is in data competency. Nearly 73% agreed that data competency is very important, but only 57% believed they have developed sufficient skills and knowledge in this area. This kind of also echoed back what Dr. Gower just shared, ethical concerns linked to the practice of social media strategies. Okay. And similarly, large gaps are also identified in technology and management competencies. The area showing the minimal gap is in communication competency. So communication professionals believe their skills and knowledge in message creation, message production, listening, and other core principles of communication are important and also well developed. So that is the good news. And when comparing between the 2 countries, we found similar gaps between perceived importance and personal qualification level. And it is important to note that professionals working in governmental organizations and nonprofits have consistently rated their business, technology, and data competencies significantly low. And to close the gap, more future training and development opportunities shall be offered to professionals working in those types of organizations. And also similar to other panelists have shared, we found significant gender gap in competency development. Of the 6 core competencies that we investigate, women only scored high in 1, which is self-reflection. And for all other core competencies, men are significantly more confident than women. So this could raise a question about whether it is because women didn't get sufficient training and development opportunity in competency, or is it because they are not at the reporting level that they could be open to those competency development opportunities. And we asked professionals to assess who shall be responsible for competency development in the communication profession. And we offered 3 choices, and out of the 3 choices, about 76.4% believe their organization should be the leading force to offer development program for their communication staff and professionals. So on the last slide I'm going to share with you is about the practice of competency development and training days. So the best approach to enrich competency is through training and continued learning. So our study showed communication professionals in North America have completed an average of 29 training days in the past year. And of the 29 days, 19 days are actually during their regular work days, while 10 days, which is about 34%, are out of their free time, such as weekends or even holiday breaks. So when comparing across different types of organizations, we found communication professionals working agencies actually reported the highest amount of time devoted to competency development. And while those working in governmental organizations reported the lowest, and they also remember, I revealed earlier, they also reported the lowest proficiency level in data and technology, while they received the lowest amount of training. And the mid-career professionals, those in the age groups of 30 to 39 and 40 to 49, also reported the most hours personal training and development if compared to young and very senior professionals. And lastly, our results confirmed educational efforts through personal training and development played a significant role in closing the competency gaps in managing data and technology, which are the two weakest areas in core competency as reported by our professionals. So these are some key findings under the topic of competency development I'd like to share. Now back to you, Rick.
Okay, well, thank you, Dren. And I'm curious, do you find that the desire for individuals, when individuals, 70 plus individuals, percent plus of the individuals say that their organization should be responsible for training, you find that at odds perhaps with the changing environment we've had in the last 20 or 30 or 40 years in the country, where you didn't go to work for an organization and stay there for 35 and 40 and 45 years, get your goal watch, you had one employer. Whereas now, what is it, 5, 6, 7, 10 different employers during a career? You find that at all at odds with that attitude versus staying in one place? I'm just curious.
That's a very interesting question and important point. We didn't track their tenure year in their current organization in this study. So it's hard to make a strong or direct connection about the tenure year link to who is responsible for the training and development. We listed 3 options like professional association, their organization, and themselves. So it's quite interesting. Professional association almost tied with the their own organization, but eventually they choose, we believe our own organization shall offer development opportunity. So this kind of really, provide a pressing need and also pressing a call for their organization, no matter how long they can retain their employees. And maybe this is one key retaining factor if they continue offering training and development opportunities. So their professionals will stay longer instead of looking for other development.
Yeah, I think you may be right about that, certainly, because employees want a lot more than just a 9-to-5 job and a paycheck these days, and certainly development like that is helpful. Thank you, Dren. We'll come back to the Q&A a bit later on. One of the things that is always of interest in any type of work that we do with the North American Communications Monitor and other types of things like this is looking at issues, things that are going on, what's happening in terms of strategic issues around the North American region, and what folks in our profession think they're going to be working on now and think they might be working on in the future. What's important to them, in other words. Dr. Zerfass is ready to talk to us about that. So Ansgar, I'd ask for you to go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Indeed, it's interesting because there are so many challenges ahead. And so why does it make sense to ask those people, respondents in this monitor? As you might remember, 78% of the respondents are really first or second level leaders. So it's their perception, and it means that those issues which they rate as important will probably drive the agenda of the communication departments, of the communication agencies. And this means that these questions can be interpreted in different ways. So we asked specifically which issues will be most important for communication management PR within the next 3 years. And respondents had to pick 3 items. So we forced them really to concentrate, not to name everything. And if you see like these figures here, like 34% for the top 3 issues, it means that 1/3 of the respondents picked this issue as one of their top 3. And it really says something, because as you can see here, we had a list of 11 issues. Not all are listed here. You can see more in the full report, but it's quite clear that these 3 or 4 top issues really show up here. So the first one is really building and maintaining trust. And it's obviously linked to the question of the digital communication, of all these fake news things, of the ethical problems we heard about. Karla talked about that many professionals have a problem with how to interact with social media. And this also means there is a risk of losing trust for the organization and for themselves. So really working on the trust issue continuously is a top issue. Interestingly, if you compare that to other regions, we really didn't do that. It's not available in the report, but I had a quick look yesterday. And it's really interesting because trust is also the top 1 issue in Europe. It's a number 3 issue in Asia Pacific, but it's only number 7 in Latin America. So we see some quite interesting differences here. And why is this interesting? Because nowadays, not all, but many organizations, be it profits or non-profits, are really communicating globally, especially in the digital world. And if there are different topics, different issues, it's very important to get these data, to get such insights, really to develop really a focus of your communication strategies. Unless you don't want to really be fixed on your own perception, it's really about what's going on in the global communication landscape if you're communicating for an organization which has an outreach which is beyond one country. So the second topic, and you see number 2 and 3 are about the same level. These are clearly the 3 top topics here in North America, is really looking how to create and distribute content. And this is clearly linked to the digital transformation of our profession. Because traditionally, let's say, producing content, news is an old thing, but really how to produce it for different channels in this ever-changing 24/7 world with new formats, Clubhouse and so on, that's really a pressing operational issue for many professionals. Interestingly, here the picture is totally different. It's a top issue also in Latin America, but practitioners in Europe and Asia rate that lower. And how can this be interpreted? A top issue means this is really challenging. It means, yeah, we have to work on that. But if it's not rated so high, I think there are 2 explanations. One is it is not so important in our country, in our region, our organization. But the second interpretation is it is important, but we know how to do it. So we ask these questions in the European study since 2007. And here we really have longitudinal data. And you see quite clearly that some topics like responsibility, communication, digital really were pressing issues firsthand. And after 2 or 3 years, you see that the profession really knows how to handle it. And then it's still important, but it's not as important as other issues. So you can interpret more if you look in a comparative view on it or in a longitudinal view. But now the third issue. We talked about diversity, inclusion on different levels in the profession before. And this is really an outstanding result because here it's clearly both in US and Canada, it's one of the 3 top topics, obviously in the region, in your countries, in your culture. Totally different in other parts of the world. So out of 11 topics or issues, it's number 11 in all other regions of the world. So how can you interpret that? We cannot do it on a quantitative study, but it obviously means that the debate in society about inclusion is much stronger in the US. And talking of Europe, of the European Union, Germany as the largest country, also France as the second largest country, we see this topic coming up now with migration, with younger people coming up, but it's clearly in society on a different level. It also means in corporations, in agencies, in the communication profession, probably we'll have a similar debate in 2 or 3 years. So again, for organizations who are acting globally, or at least in different regions, different strong economic regions, it's important to understand it, because let's see, from a European perspective, also some communication activities of global companies rooted in the US are not understandable. It's understandable from a headquarter perspective, and obviously it's the other way around. If a European, if an Asian company tries to communicate in Europe or in the US, you might really have some tricky results because you don't understand what's going on, not only in society, but also in your own organization, in your agency world, in your how to hire people, how to develop people, and so on. So I think even if it's only a snapshot, it's really gives food for thought to discuss this in your teams, in the practice, depending on your reach, depending on your audiences and your people in the organization. If we move on to the second slide, again, here is a difference between the perception of women and men. There are also differences between leadership levels, and US and Canada. You can see that in the full report. But looking again at women and men, and it's really a very simple question. What are the top 3 issues? You see some quite interesting differences. For example, the first issue about building, maintaining trust, this is really driven by the man in the sample. And you remember it was mentioned in the beginning, we have like a 50-50 person sample. So it's really quite different here. So men really sense the urgency of building on trust a bit more. And obviously, probably could be expected that the diversity issue is mentioned more often as a top 3 issue by women. By the way, we have a specific section on gender equality, which we don't present here today. It's really a large section. Probably we have the chance to do a second webinar about that, because it's really great what we have found there. But it's going to more detail, because here we really address gender issues in the profession. So if you look at the women, so it's not only the tackling of diversity, equity, inclusion topics, it's also the digital evolution topic, which is more sense as a challenge. And again, here are different interpretations. Probably it depends on that women feel probably a bit more that they personally have let's say, some kind of competency gaps, or have to develop themselves. It could be related to the hierarchy level, because they really feel the pressure. We had that in the ethics section before, because if they are really working on content, you'll probably feel more that it's a problem how to get acquainted with these new issues. If you're on the leadership level, and we have more male leaders in the sample, probably you don't see these problems so much. But in the end, for the profession, it's important also for the leaders to take care of the problems, of the challenges which parts of their population in the organizations have. Last but not least, please have a look at the last row here. It's a number 11 topic. It was not on the slide before. And you see it's not so much a difference between men and women. It's about 15% overall. And the issue here is elevating and adapting competencies of communication practitioners. So it's really the last less important topic for North Americans. And that's really interesting, because we heard before from Bryan that there are really competence gaps in nearly all fields except traditional communication, how to write messages. But it comes traditionally to leadership, management, business competencies, but especially to digital competencies which are needed. And this means in practice, not creating content for Facebook, because this is still communicating, but it still means how to interpret these data, how to use bots or big data for your own profession. If you work together with those specialists, you don't have to do it themselves. There are huge gaps, and these gaps are everywhere. In Asia Pacific, in Europe, in Latin America, in North America. And this is really looking forward, a big issue for the profession, because we all know that others will take over. So I don't know the situation in US and Canada. I know it quite well all over Europe. And we see in large corporations a big issue about IT departments, marketing departments simply taking over because they are better equipped, they have more competencies, more knowledge in the field of data mining and so on. And it's interesting that while we have these issues, at the same time, the issue of we have to work on these issues, we have to focus on competency development is mentioned less often than, let's say more practical issues like, exploring the ways of creating content, which is really a core thing. Nobody else will do that in an organization. So I think lots of food for thought here. It's a quantitative study. It's intended to stimulate debates, and obviously it's different in any organization. So please feel free to download the report and start a discussion in your own group.
Absolutely, Ansgar, thank you very much, because this is food for thought. And clearly, we look at your number one issue there, which is building and maintaining trust. And you're right, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, that probably wouldn't have been anywhere nearly the top. Now, after what we've been through, we see a lot. So thank you very, very much for that. I'd like to quickly, in the remaining time, get to some questions and ask the panel to respond to some questions that we've received. I'll go ahead and start with one that came in and specifically for you, Bryan, about the differences, asking about any differences between Canadian, US and US CEOs in terms of the COVID information source of trust. Did you find that anywhere in the research?
There was a modest difference, but there was nothing dramatic. As I recall, the US CEOs were slightly more involved in, reported more involvement than the Canadian CEOs.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. Another question that we've had, and this could really go to any of the panelists because you've all touched on it one way or another in terms of findings related to men and women's evaluation of their competencies and skills. The question is it possible that women judge their skills more harshly than men, or has it had less confidence in their abilities? And then the comment here, prior research has suggested that women tend to believe they have to check all the boxes before applying for advancement, etc. What's your thought on this? I'll throw it open to the entire panel. So actually, I'll start with Dr. Gower, who's at the Planck Center, and then go from there. But I'd like to hear all your comments on that.
Yeah, I think there is something to that women tend to judge themselves a little more harshly. I do think, though, that in this sample, given that 70% of the women tended to be team members, that yes, they may be judging their competencies more harshly, but they also have different competencies probably than the CEOs and the communication leaders. So it is probably a little bit of both.
Yeah, anyone else on that? I'm sorry, anyone else have a thought on that? And this may be true also in terms of not only competencies, but in terms of things that they need to do, their position in the organization, certainly, but things that they see as issues. We talked about this a little bit with Ansgar, looking at females, women tend to look at DEI and lessen things about inclusivity and in much greater need than say males do. Is that right?
Sorry, related to your question, in fact, based on the data, we cannot say because we didn't test it. But I think all over the study, you see that it really depends on not only hierarchy, it depends also on age. If you think it's a cultural thing also, if you think of a senior leader, be it male or female, would they really talk about their need and competencies in some fields? I experience at least that for the younger generation, not only really 20s, but also 30s, 40s, talking about competency development, about your own need to be more open about that, it's really has changed over time. But probably Bryan knows that best. At least in some regions, it really makes a difference. And again, it could be a cultural thing, because talking about these issues in Asia or in Latin America about competency gaps to middle leaders is totally different, I think, than in North America or in Europe, where you have a different feeling of, let's say, continuous education, even on the leadership level. People talk about these things, people like to do these things, but in some other cultures, it's probably not so open. So you also have to look at the age group, not only at the gender group. That was my main comment here.
Yeah, well, yes, and you know, that just adds another level of complexity to our jobs and what we have to do and think about and manage and lead and all of that, because not only do you have to worry about it here, but many of us operate in multinational organizations across the globe, and what's important in location A may not be as important in location B, and we have to understand the differences there. This is one of the benefits of the Global Communications Monitor series, because we can see that across the board. Thank you. Any other comments from a panel on that?
So I would like to add on to what Karla and Ansgar just mentioned. So for this study, yes, we didn't directly, test the relationship between all this, but I would say, based on what we all have presented, we can see the holistic picture about the North American Communication Monitor within facing the fact that the DEI is one of the top pressing issues. And then the DEI is voiced more by women in the sample. And also we found significant gender gap pretty much in all topics that we investigate, from COVID responses for ethical challenges, for competency development, and even salary, which we didn't get a chance to talk about in this webinar. And we do see, consistently low ratings between men and women. So not just did they harshly judge their skills, but this is also a reflection of reality that the gaps are there. Even though, for a quantitative study like this, it's hard for us to dive deep into the reasons, but on the surface, we can see the gaps. We identify the gaps. Women are less confident in reporting their competency and abilities, and that brings a door and brings up so many questions. Why and how can we help them to build confidence? Is that because they have to do 200% work to prove their competency if compared to men, or is something different that they didn't get sufficient training opportunities?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm going to ask one quick question. It came in on Facebook for Karla, but I'll ask the entire panel once again. It's about best ethics trainings programs around the country that any of us may know of. The comment is, I've been to several and they all leave me, I think probably they varied and some of them lack dramatically. Are there programs that any of you are aware of that you would recommend for that type of training?
I have to say, no, I think that the person's right. They are sort of all over the map. I think one thing that you can do, even just among your own team, is just to talk about scenarios and sort of work through them. Who are the stakeholders? What duties do we have to these people who are going to be impacted? And just thinking through them as a team and thinking about your organization's mission and vision, et cetera. And scenarios can be a really good way to look at an ethical issue as opposed to looking at the classical approaches. Right. But I have no particular one I think is better than another.
Yeah, unfortunately, the consistency is a little lumpy there, isn't it? Yeah. That's unfortunate. Well, our time is about out. I want to thank all of our panelists and researchers for participating today. Dr. Meng, Dr. Gower, Dr. Zerfass, Dr. Reber, thank you so very much for joining us today for this very interesting discussion. I want to remind you that this webinar will be replayed. It'll be available to you on Facebook as well as at the Planck Center website. That's planckcenter.ua.edu. We'll get that. I'd also encourage you, several of the panelists have suggested this today, download the North American Communications Monitor. That is available also on the Planck Center website. It's a full report and there's a lot more great information there. It's available under the NACM tab at the Planck Center website. And if you have any other questions or think of things or want to follow up with something, just get in contact with us at the Planck Center. We'll be happy to get you the right person. Contact information for the Planck Center once again at the website, planckcenter.ua.edu. .ua.edu. I know it by memory in my sleep even sometimes. And I want to especially thank our executive producer today, Colleen Dolan, who's been a gem to work with and who has put this all together for us. Thank you so very, very much, Colleen. We appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, thanks for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again at future webinars, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.